When you dare to share, you break the silence. When you dare to share, you speak your truth. When you dare to share, you use the full strength of your voice. When you dare to share, it brings opportunity to own your story. So tell it, be heard, and at the same time, your sharing is someone else's learning, inspiration, motivation, empowerment, and hope. There's always an element to each of our stories that remains a secret. For some, we feel it's a dirty little secret. Dare to share your untold story exposes these secrets in a welcoming and positive way. I encourage each of you out there to dare yourself to share what is yours to tell. When we dare, it is the courage to do something really important. Let this be a vow to each and every single one of us that we take risk, we brave, confront, and face what is, while inspiring and empowering all communities. So let's break that silence and tap into mental beauty. This is Salima Jadavji, your podcast host, a practicing clinical social worker, and your mental wellness connoisseur. Welcome to the Dare to Share Your Untold Story podcast, episode number 20. The twist of the imposter, racial trauma internalized, and the mastery of the two. To all my fellow listeners, before we get started, I'm just dropping in a note to give you a heads up that this podcast might be emotionally triggering for you. We do invite guests onto the show who share openly about extremely difficult life moments with exposure and impact of what the struggles have been like. The intensity of each episode could have a variable impact on your emotional and mental well-being based on your own personal story. If at any point the topic becomes uncomfortable or upsetting to you in any way, please do not pressure yourself to listen. Instead, be kind to yourself, do some self-care, and perhaps give another episode a try. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing our truly daring guest, Sheliza Jamal. Sheliza Jamal is the founder of Curated Leadership, a coaching firm that fosters partnerships with leadership teams, nonprofits, and corporations to develop their knowledge in the areas of equity and diversity to build inclusive communities. As an equity and inclusion facilitator and Ontario certified educator, Sheliza brings over a decade of experience in designing and implementing training and development programs aimed at addressing inequitable outcomes for underserved communities. She has a background in arts education and often uses theater-based techniques to develop embodied empathy to engage participants in dialogue about oppression. Sheliza uses a calling-in approach to bring people together to listen and learn with empathy. Sheliza is a graduate of the Harvard Graduate School of Education and is currently completing her PhD at the Ontario Institute of Studies in Education at the University of Toronto in the Department of Social Justice Education, with research focusing on anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism in teacher education programs. Hello, Sheliza. Welcome to the Dare to Share Your Untold Story podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here with you.
It's a real pleasure for me to have you on the show today and have this opportunity to have this conversation, to have this gab. I'm immensely thankful about your willingness to be here to share and be part and share your story, at least part of your story. For your support in standing with me to help break barriers of mental stigma is something that is close to my heart. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm really excited to chat with you today.
So Sheliza, I know that you are all up to speed about what this podcast is about, but I do want to emphasize it's about bringing forward untold stories of what people go through, whether it's directly about mental health or something else. And we know that no matter what the story is, there is impact to one's mental health in some way, shape, or form, and it gets buried away. Creating this platform, it's my passion project. It's to serve an important goal of mine, which is to break the barriers of mental stigma that have been conditioned in our society. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. It's all about encouraging people to dare themselves to tell their tale, the sharing of, what people have hesitation for expressing. And of course, I'm bringing forward this trend called the mental beauty rethink. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think that That is so interesting, and I think what you say is very important, that we need to break the stigma around mental health. We really work hard on our physical health. We work out, we try to eat healthy. There's so many products out there. And then when we say mental health, folks kind of have a stigma. And so I think I like that, right? Mental beauty, because all of us have a physical body, but we also have a mental body. And I think
Yes.
it's so important to talk about what is working well for us and what we need to do differently, because mental health is part of physical health is part of mental health. So I'm really grateful that you have me here today, because I think for me as a woman of color, it's really important to break that stigma, and
Mhm.
share stories around mental health and resilience, but also stories of where mental health perhaps does suffer sometimes.
Yeah, and to be able to do it without the shame.
Absolutely.
So, Shaliza, we're about to step into a raw conversation. Are you all set?
I'm all set. I'm excited.
I'm also very pumped. I'm ready to do this. The first question I would like to start with is give us the newspaper headline of how you would title your untold story. How would it read?
Right. So this is a difficult one because my
Mm-hmm.
story is always in flux, but I would say a headline for me right now would be Breaking Through as a Woman of Color, a story of resilience and healing.
Breaking through as a woman of color, a story of resilience and healing.
Yes.
What does this headline mean to you?
I think we talk about mental health, we talk about perfectionism in my community a lot. And for me, breaking through as a woman of color is really thinking about what are the obstacles that I faced, both for my race and ethnicity and gender identities, but also what does it mean to come into my adulthood and really overcome some of the anxiety, some of the imposter syndrome that was tied to that anxiety, and the perfectionism that was tied to the anxiety, and some
Mm-hmm.
of the healing that I've had to do as a result of all of that, and a result of my identities and my experiences. And so for me, I imagine breaking through, a thick fog or a big cloud, and consistently working on that. So for me, it's about that active place of breaking through, not a final moment that I'm already there,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm constantly working on that, and that I choose that resilience and that healing in my journey.
So much that gets unpacked from this headline.
Mhm.
There's just so much richness there. It's going to be such a great segue for us to, get into this untold aspect of your story. So let's begin. If it's possible, share with me the who, the what, the when, the wheres of your story.
For sure, yeah. I think I probably would start, as young as age 5, and thinking about being one of the only brown or South Asian girls in my school.
Mhm.
There weren't many people of color growing up in Coquitlam, British Columbia. I had my sister and I in the school. I had a few people from my community, but overall, there were not a lot of people of color in the community and in the school. And I always felt like a bit of exclusion, whether it was, through, comments or teasing or bullying, whether it was through the showcasing of my culture. Back then there was a lot of show and tell, right? Coming dressed up
Mhm.
as in a sari and bringing roti or bringing samosas to school. All of that was part of that culture and what we knew about multiculturalism then. So I always sort of felt like I was different. And then my name was so different. So it started there as well. And I remember always liking Lisa instead of Sheliza. Whereas now, if someone were to call me Lisa, I would sort of rebel. But
Right.
that was a piece too. It was, not having a face or a name or a hair color that matched the white girls around me, right? Not having blonde hair and blue eyes, not sharing the same holidays.
Right.
um, I remember once I told someone, I got in trouble actually for telling someone that Santa didn't exist.
Oh god.
Um, yes,
Oh my
I
goodness.
think I was in grade 3, but I was just, trying to school them a little bit, but I got in. And so a lot of those experiences, I think relationships with friends were also part of that story of really thinking about and recognizing that I was a person of color, right? I was
Mhm.
someone who had something different. And at that time, in the 80s, it was more about exclusion than inclusion. So, in thinking about that, a lot of my feelings of exclusion and othering followed me into high school. I attended a fine arts high school because I felt like the mainstream high school didn't really have much to offer me. As a theater person, I had been dancing and singing and performing in productions, which was, I think, my outlet. As I reflected as I was older, I think the theater was always my outlet to express myself. Despite, my mom putting me into all these activities, it was
Mhm.
definitely my platform to be someone else or pretend or to shine. And I loved that attention. I still love it. And, in school, we created a lot of theater productions. And in high school, I started to get a lot of attention for my differences. So it was a bit of a difference between elementary school and high school, whereas it was a bit of exclusion and bullying for the othering
Mhm.
in elementary. In high
Mm.
school, it was like, oh, you are, terms that I don't really like using, but you're exotic, or you look different, or your name
Mhm.
is so exotic, or you look so different, we can't place you, or your name is so exotic. And while I didn't really like those comments, I did get the attention from it and started to
Mhm.
understand, okay, my difference is actually something great or different. Difference is sort of valued in this way. So I sort of leaned into that.
Mhm.
And then another part of the story is, when I was 14, another 14-year-old girl in Duncan, BC, Rena Verk, was murdered by her classmates, her white classmates.
Mhm.
And for me, that was a real awakening and recognition of my brownness. She was also South Asian, I was South Asian, and there were
Mhm.
so many connections. We were both the same age. She had this group of girls that she was trying to fit in with, and at the time had snuck out of the house to hang out with them,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
they had beat her to death.
Yeah, they savagely that was a savage beating,
Absolutely.
and I remember that tale because I wasn't 14, I was a little older than that, but I remember I was in high school, and I was so uncomfortable to hear the news. I mean, of course, I was sad for her and for her family. Back in that day, it was very hard to talk about these things at school, and it was
Absolutely.
one of those things that you could just have that chill that up your
Mhm.
spine,
Mhm.
it was one of those moments where it felt so gross. Like I felt like I wanted to vomit. It was just such a horrifying thing, to know that such a young woman savagely beaten and murdered by teenagers, and the attackers mainly girls,
Mhm.
and then
People she
after
thought were her friends
and
too,
these were
right?
her
She thought they were her
friends.
friends. Yeah.
Yes. And I even remember that it was the one individual who returned with an accomplice and dragged her into that
Right.
waterway
Yes.
and held her
Because she had
underwater
survived.
until she st-
Yeah.
and then until she stopped moving, right? So, and that was in 1997, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. And that's the sad part, right? She thought these folks were her friends,
Yes.
and it reminded me of trying to fit in elementary and somewhat still trying to fit in high school, where I was still the only brown woman, the only woman of color in
Mhm.
my grade. I did have one other Asian friend who was in the music program, but it was just the two of us. And, as you're pointing out, Rena survived the first round of beatings and then
Yes.
was dragged back and held with a shoe underneath the water until she died. And that was horrific.
Mhm.
And it just hit so close to home that that could be me, that could be
Mm.
any of my friends.
Mhm.
And it was scary. And it was, for me, I think, a real recognition of my brownness, but the fear of being different. That, yes, it's great to be different, but there's also a fear it can come at a price. And that was really scary. And I also remember, in elementary and sometimes in high school, also being a Muslim, being an Ismaili Muslim, always having to defend my religion. Either being called Paki or terrorist, and having to
Mhm.
say, oh, I'm not that kind of Muslim, or I'm not that kind of
Right.
brown, or the confusion between Sikhism and Islam. Oh, your dad doesn't wear a turban, or do you wear a turban? Different things like that. So all these things that I tried to stifle and push away, and I really tried to other myself,
Yeah,
and
it's like othering the other. also, right?
Absolutely, and for me, the vocabulary that I learned for that experience was that it was part of internalized racism. You
Mhm.
know, when I was 10, 11, I told my mom, "I want blonde hair, I want blue eyes because I wanna be successful," and she said, "Oh, don't be silly. You can do anything you want, you can be successful." But
Mhm.
for me, I thought, "Oh, only if I
Had a
have blonde
certain
hair and blue
image.
eyes." Yeah, have an
Right, like the
image, have what's in TV, you know, skinny,
right.
white, blonde,
Uh-huh.
then I will be valid and I will be able to achieve that success. And
Right.
then throughout high school, and then this culmination, and when it came to this very tragic murder, the first kind of big event in my life, I would say,
Mhm.
of trauma, it
Mhm.
all sort of came to a head of where that lack of confidence and that kind of self-hate came from.
Mhm.
Hating my skin color, hating my name, hating anything to do with Bollywood in India. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
And all of that came to a head, and I realized what that was in that
Mhm.
moment. And there was also fear there as well,
Fear
in
is
that
such a
moment.
driving force, right? Like it
Absolutely.
when we're in that place of fear, it can dictate and provoke so many things within us that we would normally not choose if we were in a calm state of mind.
Mhm.
When we don't have that threat response activated, right?
Mhm.
Shalisa, I'm curious about I know in a private conversation we've talked about imposter syndrome.
Mhm.
Can you tie that into your story? Can you share that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a lot of where imposter syndrome came from. So I kind of define imposter syndrome as,
Yeah.
feeling like what you've earned is not really yours. Like it's a sign of luck. Like you don't really believe in your achievements. And
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
think this idea of internalized racism really couples with that idea of imposter syndrome. So I kind of always thought, okay, the good things that are happening to me are luck, or I don't really deserve them. And a lot of that came back to these feelings of not being good enough. So, you know, some examples would be, when I did well in my theater program, it was a conservatory type program, not feeling like that was me, that it was just luck or that role, not really believing in my talent. And then it translated into university when I got into, York University for acting. It translated there as, okay, am I good enough? Am I not good enough? Second guessing myself. And it even led me to sort of not take chances. So my dream was always to go to Juilliard for theater,
Mhm.
and I never applied because I was so scared of being rejected,
Mhm.
because perfectionism was a big part of my life, but also that internalized racism and trauma was part of my life. So
Mhm.
those two things together made me feel like, how will I manage this rejection? If I try to do something that I really want and I don't get in, then it's going to make me feel even worse about myself. So there's so many things wrapped up in there. And then when I did get rejected in certain ways, like in programs in university, or, when I was at a casting call or something,
Right.
I would re internalize those feelings of not good enough.
Right. So you'd go through this loop almost.
Absolutely, and I will say that
Right.
the loop never ends, because
Yeah.
when I went to Harvard for my master's, when I was applying for my master's, I remember they said that we would get the results March 1st. I remember, before midnight, just, refreshing, 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 refreshing to
Mhm.
figure that piece out. And
Mhm.
I got the news that I got in, and I couldn't believe it. And I didn't tell anybody for a long time except for my parents. I thought, they're going to take it away from me. They're going to say they made a mistake. There was this huge scandal in the States. I don't know if you know about it, but
Mhm.
there was one school
Mhm.
where the acceptance letters went to the rejected students and the rejection letters went to the
Right.
accepted. So I was like,
Yeah.
that's going to happen to me. If I
Right.
tell too many people, it's just going to go haywire.
Right.
So I felt that a lot. And then, people would ask me, are you going to Boston, or where are you going to school, rather? And I'd say,
Right.
oh, I'm going to the States. They'd pry more. I'd say
Right.
Boston. They'd pry more. And I would rarely say Harvard. And I remember
Mhm.
when I came to the student of color orientation at Harvard, it was a shared experience among many, if not all, of my peers who were identifying as Black, Indigenous, or people of color. That this was
Mhm.
not a experience that was new to them or was unique to me, and that felt comforting, but also sad that this was something that a lot
Yeah.
of people of color experience.
Right. And Shaliza, in giving us a little disclosure about myself, when I applied for my master's program, I applied, and for me, I had this idea that I need to make sure when I put on the application that I'm a minority. Like, it was very important for me to check off that
Mhm.
box, the minority,
Mhm.
where previously I didn't. And so I was
Mhm.
convinced that, well, they accept this many percent of students if they're a minority. And I am a minority. I can own that. So in my mind, my narrative was I'm owning who I am.
Yes, yeah.
So I'm going to put this minority, I'm going to check this box off, and
Mhm.
then I'll be able to get into the program. That is what I thought, not my capacity, my
Absolutely.
abilities, my strengths, my experience, everything I had to offer. And when I got in, I was fully surrendering and accepting that it's because they had to accept me because I'm a minority. They
Yeah.
accepted me because I'm the minority. They had to accept me. This is how I was able to get in. I could not acknowledge that I had something to offer.
And that's the deadly part of it, right? And similar to that, I think is, when I applied to teachers college the first time in Ontario, I didn't get in and I thought I've got all the recommendations, all the requirements. Let me go talk to the dean. And she said to me, "You didn't check off the minority box.
Mhm.
And there were certain spots for minorities, so that's why you didn't get in." And I knew that was BS.
Mhm.
But I still internalized that
Yeah.
to think exactly what you're saying, that, "Oh, so all my credentials aren't good enough, but if I had checked off that box, you would have let me in." When I didn't actually have a word for imposter syndrome till I was in my master's. I didn't know what it was. I just knew that I felt bad about myself and I didn't know. And, I remember telling one of my good friends that I got in and their mom saying to me, "Well, take her with you, and how did you get in?" Or people asking me, like, "How did you get in?" And I started to second guess myself when they asked me that because I thought,
Right.
"What do they mean?" And I asked my white friends, I said, "Did you ever get asked how you got into Harvard?" They said, "No." And so my new response was, "I applied."
Ah,
Because I think
fact.
before I would feel bad about myself and kind of
Mhm.
explain myself. And because, even
Right.
people of color are part of this system of white supremacy and capitalism and colonization that tells us we're not good enough, that we internalize that. So they were replicating what they knew, right? And asking me,
Right.
"How did you get in?" As if it was because I clicked off a box, right?
There's so much to unpack when it comes to how the imposter impacts the individual that
Mhm.
has experienced so much racial trauma,
Mhm.
and when it's been internalized, just like how you've been sharing today.
Mhm.
Can you say a little bit more about how you were affected having gone through this journey of racialized trauma, the how it was internalized? You've certainly been alluding to a lot of the self-hate and so much of what you experienced along the way. Any other aspects that you can share today?
Sure. I think I'll say that, part of that internalized racism and oppression and that racial trauma was, denying myself my own identity,
Mhm.
and like both my racial, ethnic, religious, um, ethnic origin, ancestral, anything to do with who I was. So that was really difficult and difficult to reconcile. And I think it took me to university to really get to really love that part of me. But it also led to some anxiety. I alluded to some of the bullying,
Mhm.
that perfectionism, and that real desire to be accepted into white society. And for me, I talk about this a lot with my friends, is this kind of identity complex, or this, aspect of not really knowing who I am as a hyphenated identity. My parents are from East Africa. They're born and raised there. My grandparents moved from India when they were maybe 5 years old or younger. So they don't
Mhm.
really have a strong Indian identity.
Mhm.
And so they were raised in East Africa. My parents were raised in East Africa. I'm born here. And so being like a South Asian, I look Indian, I'm South Asian, and then from an East African cultural background, you don't really fit into any mold. And I think that caused a lot of anxiety and a lot of confusion as to what is my identity. And I think, as I say in my headline, that I'm breaking through because it's still things that I'm working through to really create my own sense of self. Um,
You've
And
peeled
I
away a
think
lot of layers, but
yeah,
there's still more to dig through.
absolutely, and back to what your question was, like,
Mhm.
imposter syndrome is really related to that because I feel that as
Mhm.
a woman of color, I have to work twice as hard, and that shouldn't be the case, but I have to work twice as hard to kind of prove myself, even to my own community that I'm valid. And, if folks know about the model minority myth, that is sort of a complex that was created through actually a political campaign in the States that was made to create this idea and pit racial groups against each other. And it really leads to this idea of bootstrap theory, where if you work hard, you'll achieve, and it negates any of
Mhm.
the systemic barriers that exist.
Mhm.
And so I think that in itself, without going too much in depth, kind of leads to
Mhm.
this idea of perfectionism
Mhm.
and striving for perfectionism. And out of that perfectionism, I realized I have a bit of anxiety,
Mm.
because I'm always trying to achieve that and be better, and not really understanding the consequences of that.
I'm hearing you talk about so many different elements, and the fact that you brought up, the bootstrap theory and striving for perfectionism, and how that can form into some mold of anxiety. It's so important to recognize that and have awareness of that. And even the recognition of imposter syndrome. You're right. I don't think I actually knew for myself, when I was
Mhm,
growing up, that it was imposter syndrome. I think I truly
mhm,
believed I either had certain qualities or I didn't.
mhm,
Right.
mhm.
And I think it's so important that we start giving some acknowledgement to what these things are and externalize so we don't sort of pull them in.
Absolutely.
And I think when we externalize, we can visualize it, we can see it, and we can separate it from ourselves, to
Yeah,
then be able to say, okay, how can I take charge of this part, or what are the parts of this in this story that I have control over, or what about this narrative that maybe I could create something different for now? What can I recreate here? Right?
absolutely. Because I think there's an element of code switching there that's part of that
Yes.
imposter syndrome. And I think critics of imposter syndrome will also say that we're not imposters of anything, but that is true. However, we do have some
It's
sort
the
of
experience.
yeah, and
It's the
there's like a
felt
low
experience.
self-confidence.
Yeah.
Exactly. Like there's a sense of low confidence and low self-esteem that occurs.
Yeah.
And I know folks don't like the labels, but that's really what imposter syndrome is about. It's about
Yeah.
not believing that you deserve it or you're worth it or that self-esteem bit.
I get it. I mean, I don't think it's always helpful to put yourself in some sort of a box or for people to put you
Mhm.
in a box. But I think
Mhm.
sometimes if you're trying to understand your subjective experience, you need to it's helpful to give it some
Mhm.
names and some words so that you can work through the thoughts and the emotions that come up. And you mentioned a few minutes ago, you were talking about your name. At what point in your life, or what grade were you in specifically when you accepted your name? And what
Mm.
got you to accept your name? Because I know that even when you were getting positive regard for it being an exotic name and something special, it was still something not desired for you, right? It was
Yeah.
undesirable for you.
Sure. I think I'll tell you the where the dislike for it came from was people pronouncing it wrong.
Mm.
People calling me Chelsea or Shelzia or Sheliza. I mean, it being different. That's where it
Mm-hmm.
came from, not liking it. And then I think it was in high school when I was different and it was celebrated, that attention kind of came there and I started to like it. I still remember people butchering my name. And
Mm-hmm.
I'd say in grade 11 and 12, I started to like my name because I started to gain more confidence.
Okay.
And part of that is, puberty and getting to know yourself and just becoming a woman and getting to that adulthood phase. And
Okay.
then I think when I moved to Toronto for university,
Mm-hmm.
I think I began to really like my name because I was around people that had beautiful names that were not just Sarah or Lisa or Stephanie or
Mm-hmm.
John, you
Mm-hmm.
know? So I started to see that it was normal, it was okay. I could still be that person. And I think it was, we talk about role models and representation. I think that's also where it came from. You know, seeing people without the basic names and people with ethnic sounding names that were in positions of power that were doing great things.
And I'm hearing you talk about stepping into more and more discomfort as you
Mhm.
gained a little bit more confidence, right? So in the therapy room, I talk a lot about the terms, comfortably uncomfortable,
Mhm, mhm.
It sounds like what you're sharing is you're getting comfortably uncomfortable with this acceptance and with the reality of, I can hold space for the unique aspects of who I am and my background and where I've come from and connect with society exactly as I am.
Absolutely, and it took some reclaiming, and, one thing that I'll share that I tried to do is, when I was in university, actually, I performed in the vagina monologues, and I thought it was so empowering.
Mhm.
And then I've always noticed there's a lack of voices that look like me or look like women of color, and, when I was at Harvard, my friend that I met there told me about this project called Yoni Ki Baat, and yoni is the kind of, I guess, Hindi word for vagina, like the vagina monologues was Yoni Ki Baat.
Oh, okay.
So talking about our vaginas, and I thought that was a great concept. I thought I'm always looking for these stories, but I don't feel like I fit in this way or that way. And so we created this little collective called South Asian Sisters,
Mhm.
and we invited women that were from India, like, that were international students from other places in the South Asian diaspora, from Canada, from the UK, from America, to join us and to write stories about their experiences using their voices, whereas Eve Ensler interviewed folks and then wrote the stories in her own words and had them performed by actors. We had folks come up with their own stories and shame and for me and share rather. And that was another way of reclaiming and really owning. And so I think all of these experiences
Mhm.
have sort of added to the confidence and the security, like you said, the discomfort and the comfortably uncomfortable aspects, and really unlayering and unpeeling that layer of who I am. And they've all supported that.
The part that I'm struck by, there's this aspect of you that as you've stepped into to the discomfort, you've like felt it, you've explored
Hmm.
it, and then your tolerance increases. And that has led to a lot of positive impact, right? Working through your
Hmm.
imposter syndrome, gaining tools to show up with confidence and resilience. So, the social justice work that you have built yourself to do, that personal
Hmm.
growth that was attached to it, and the skills and the opportunities that you chose that you can share with other women of color, and your ability to mentor young women, I'm certain that this must be the nuggets that you're very grateful for.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm super grateful to be able to be supported by great family and friends and support system and therapists and all that kind of stuff to be able to make these discoveries, because a lot of times women of color don't really understand what's happening. They don't understand perhaps imposter syndrome, or they don't have the tools or the capacity to work through that. And so, in the work that I do, it is emotionally taxing, right, to talk about
Yes,
anti-racism
of course.
and racial trauma a lot. And so I
Mhm.
think using what I learn to then create opportunities and build those skills, and share with others, is really important to me, for sure. I really value the learning tools, and for me, every moment is a teaching and learning moment
Yeah,
that I've
I
learned
agree.
from.
I agree.
Hmm.
In my experience as well, I totally echo that. So, Shaliza, um, I know we were talking about, everything that you've been exposed to and had to fend for and work through and be in disguise of, and the imposter and all those aspects, and even the perfectionism and striving for it, and how some of it came out in anxiety. Did you have a formal diagnosis of anxiety, or do you feel like you were just experiencing the heavy symptoms of it?
Yeah, I don't think I have no formal diagnosis, but
Hmm.
I think I was experiencing symptoms, and a lot of that came up in my master's. But I think that I'd had those symptoms before and just thought it was normal,
Yeah, it was like you found a way to manage it.
Yeah.
Like you could keep it at bay. It was a lot of work to manage, but
Yes.
you could manage it. But when you had your master's program, do you
Yeah.
feel like something different happened?
Yeah, I think I got a lot of physiological symptoms. I think I'm always a procrastinator. I work really well under pressure,
Uh-huh.
which is kind of an antithesis to anxiety, but I don't know what it is. I work really well when I have less time to complete a task.
Yeah.
I can go full force, stay up for like days on end
Oh
and finish
goodness.
it. Yeah, but where the anxiety was coming up was really physiological. So I have asthma, and I started to get this chronic cough
Mhm.
from stress and anxiety during my program, because of course I wanted to do super well. It was Harvard, and I noticed that this cough came through this stress and anxiety, and I'd had it once before a couple years back when I was in a stressful job, but I didn't realize it till I was in my master's and there was no other conditions
Right.
and it came up again. I've also felt it with like my heart beating fast or,
Mhm.
feeling like I was going to cry, like I can control things. But I was always able to manage it. And so, although I don't have a formal diagnosis, I like to say, perhaps I have high functioning anxiety where I have the tools, to breathe through, to be mindful, and all those things to cope with it. But definitely, I think a lot of these experiences I've had have kind of led me to both the coping strategies, but also to the manifestation of these physiological
Mhm.
experiences of anxiety.
Oh, yeah, this is the body totally saying, "Hey, hi, hello. I'm trying to give
Mhm.
you some other signals. You're not listening to me, so I'm gonna show up in this way," right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And so along with that really that the racing heartbeat and the chronic cough that really showed up when you were under that sort of pressure with stress and anxiety and nothing else was around, did you experience, like, any other physiological things like, nausea or headaches, or did you feel restless at all? Like, what else happened?
Yeah, the restlessness definitely because I feel like it was that flight or fight kind of mode.
Mhm.
So the restlessness was there. I think, yeah, nausea, more headaches less so, but nausea, yeah, I'd always
Mhm.
feel like I either needed to eat a lot or I couldn't eat, which is another podcast episode topic, but
Don't worry,
really
you can
thinking
come
about that.
back.
Absolutely. But yeah, I think it was just like that feeling sick. And then sometimes it was like wanting to shut down, like just wanting to go and crawl into my bed and sleep and avoid it all. But then knowing that those deadlines were looming.
Mhm.
But a lot of the times it almost felt like gasping for air, and talking myself into breathing. Um, and a lot of this comes from, a lot of the stories I told about the trauma and
Mhm.
the, perfectionism and the imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
And then I've been really working to understand my connection to my ancestors and to breathing and mindfulness to figure out ways that I can break through that
Mhm.
because these are all parts of us, like we were talking in the beginning, but we need that mental beauty and we need to work on and exercise that mental beauty in order for it to be resilient.
So we talked about fear a lot, right? And we
Mhm.
talked about
Mhm.
shame a little bit. What
Mhm.
other emotions do you recall experiencing back then?
Yeah, I think shame and guilt, fear for sure. Sometimes even jealousy, right? Trying to be perfect and trying to be perfect in everyone's eyes.
Do you feel like there was this desire of that true acceptance by the white community?
Yeah, absolutely. I tried to I was a chameleon. We talked about this idea of code switching, and it was like I
Yeah.
was always code switching, and that was mentally draining as well.
Mhm.
Um,
It's a lot of work
but
because
yeah,
you're
and it
on.
felt sad.
Yeah, you're on and you're constantly planning and trying to make sure you're saying things in the best way and connecting in the best way and weaving in and out in the most
Yeah,
seamless way.
yeah, and then to that end, those are like feelings of exhaustion,
Of
right?
course, that's
And
gonna be lots of fatigue and exhaustion for
yeah,
sure.
but I know the acceptance is a big thing. It still is a big thing,
Yeah.
and I definitely felt that a lot in elementary school
Mhm.
and high school, really wanting to seek acceptance from my peers,
Yeah. What about
and wanting to be
sadness?
valid. Yeah, the sadness was there too because I sometimes felt isolated and excluded. I wanted to be validated, and I
Mhm.
think even in university or my master's rather, when I was working on papers and we're talking about our identity,
Mhm.
they were so difficult for me to write about because I
Mhm.
had squashed all those memories away
Mm.
trying to be somebody else. Like I used to want to be, I loved figure skaters and like Elizabeth Manley and
Mhm.
all that. And there was another one, I forgot her name, but I used to like her and I used to call myself Liz or Lisa. And like I
Mhm.
have notebooks where I'd sign my name Lisa, and now I hate if anyone would ever to call me Lisa.
Right.
But that's like that sadness piece, I
Mhm.
think. It's like I don't think we ever talked about it in my family, not for my
Mhm.
parents' fault, but just because we
Mhm.
never talked about that. And I never knew how to express that because I didn't know that that was like racial pain or trauma or healing.
Right.
I didn't know that those feelings of sadness were really longing for acceptance and because I felt so excluded. So a lot of that is I think tied together. I think everything is really tied together. The anxiety, the imposter syndrome, the racial trauma, the perfectionism, the needing to feel like I belonged and fit in, all of it.
I can really hear in all of the stories and all of the sharings, all of the different parts that we've been sort of dabbling into. I hear the breakthroughs. I'm hearing the
Hmm.
breakthroughs. You have so much resilience. I'm curious about what your key message is to the listeners of our show.
I think to be kind and compassionate with yourself. I believe that I perhaps wasn't so kind and compassionate with myself, and to understand, not only in today's environment of a pandemic, but in general, we are learning and growing beings. We're always going to be learning and growing until the day that we are no longer.
Hmm.
And so I think that's a big message. I also think it's important to listen to yourself physiologically, mentally, and pay attention to those cues, right? And do something for yourself, whether that is, seek the therapy, read, write, journal, whatever it is.
Hmm.
But my message is that to think about the resilience, to think about the resilience of your ancestors and find those tools that will help you break through into that resilience
Hmm.
when you need it the most.
The piece about resilience of your ancestors, I think it's such a neat one for people to connect to.
Hmm.
We sometimes forget. I mean, I know sometimes I forget too. I don't know that I've forgotten so much as something you mentioned earlier is that we get conditioned to tuck it
Hmm.
away, right? We get conditioned to just um, you know, sort of squash our own memories, like you mentioned, squashing your memories and living someone else's.
Hmm. And that's a part of the system, right? Because
Yeah.
we're living in this like white supremacist systems and structures of oppression teach us that our culture is no good, right? There's bullying, there's racism. I mean, look at Quebec. There's Bill 21 that's saying, religious headgear is not acceptable. And so we internalize these little and big things as children that permeate and come up and show up as adults, where we are taught to self hate. And so it's really about understanding and recognizing that and working to love ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah. It's all about working to love ourselves. Simple words that have a very big impact. And it's
Mhm.
important for us to keep talking about things like this, the simple aspects and the complexities, normalizing the feelings that come up by having these sorts of discussions. So I'm curious, what would you say is your game changer sort of agent? Something that would have been inspirational for you that's that's close to you that reflects your untold story. So, I mean, this could be like a mantra or an affirmation, a quote, or a book or a
Yeah.
person or an event.
Yeah, I'm so lucky to have, so many people and teachers, formal and informal, in my life that have made a mark on me. But I would say, at that 25 age where I thought it was like life changing, quarter century, I picked up Don Miguel Ruiz's book, The Four Agreements.
Mm-hmm.
And that book was, I think, transformational for me. And I'll just share with the listeners, the four agreements. So the first agreement is be impeccable with your word. So
Mm-hmm.
talking about integrity and speaking truth. And then the second one was don't take things personally. And that's something I did a lot because I was feeling invalid or insecure
Mm-hmm.
and overcompensating. The third one is not to make any assumptions. And so to ask those questions and lead with courage. And the last one, which is what I was sort of leading to, was always do your best, because that can change from moment to moment, situation and circumstance to circumstance. So
Mm-hmm.
I think the book, The Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz, really helped me to start understanding myself, because I think it was at that age, around 25, that I started to reflect on some of the teachings that I was sharing today about who I am, kind of getting to know myself better. And so these four agreements, I would read it over and over again. And I remember when I had a gift to give someone, I would always gift it to them and then buy a new copy and then re-gift that copy and just keep gifting it and keep buying stacks of this book because it had meant so much to me,
Yeah.
and in both my personal and professional practice. And
It's a
really,
It's a
accepting
very helpful
myself.
book.
Yeah.
There's so many messages in that book.
Mhm.
Um, and you can catch something different from it each time you read it.
Oh, I totally agree with that, yes.
Yeah? Yeah, it's a great book. So, Sheliza, what's an organization or a cause that speaks to you? Something that's been impactful to you on your journey that maybe you want to give a shout out to?
Yeah, there's so many amazing organizations, it's hard to name one. I wanna say
Okay,
that
name a couple.
I yeah, I'll tell you, when I was in grade 12, we had the, YWCA mentorship program,
Hmm.
and I was mentored with a Black actress, and I was an actress, and that was probably one of the most amazing things to have another woman of color as my mentor, a fellow actor. And so, shout out to YWCA for that mentorship program back in the 90s.
Is
That
it
was
still
just so
around?
impactful. I don't know. This was in BC. I just remember going there, feeling like an adult, meeting Leslie.
Yeah.
We did keep in touch throughout university when I was in theater school, and now I think I've lost her contact information. But my dad reminded me of her when I was in town the other day. He said, "Remember your mentor?" And I used to drop you to her place, and you would chat. And so I think that was a really impactful um, program that I did. But I would say I just like to shout out the YWCA because I think that is part of the transformation for me
Hmm.
as a woman of color and a
Hmm.
performer, and now an entrepreneur. So I think that's something I hold near and dear.
Yeah. It sounds like it was very pivotal for you,
Hmm.
and very eye opening and an inspiration for you. So, how can people connect with you? How are you findable? If someone feels like, wow, I want to connect with Shaliza, I want to talk with her a bit. How are you findable?
Absolutely. So my website's shalizajamal.com. We'll put that in the show notes.
Mm-hmm.
And also curated-leadership.com. If you just Google curated leadership, you'll find that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm on Instagram at curated leadership and LinkedIn and Twitter under my first and last name. So you can find me there. I'm happy to connect.
And Shaliza, are you on Clubhouse?
Yes, I'm on Clubhouse. Thank you for reminding me. Yes, Shaliza
Under
Jamal, and then I have a group, curated conversations.
Okay. So it is under your
Hmm.
name, but then you've got
Yes,
a group.
Shaliza Jamal.
Yeah.
Yes, so you can find me, and then the group is findable through that. I'd love to have you. I haven't been on for a few weeks. It's been a bit busy, but I've had some great conversations with folks. So looking forward
Right.
to more.
Amazing. You have just dared yourself to share your untold story.
Oh,
Congratulations.
thank you so much. Thank you for holding space for me.
Shaliza, I'm truly humbled for having you on the show today. You coming on as a guest on the show, it has been a riveting conversation. Very
Thank
relatable.
you.
So needed to be told the exact way that you did the telling. Thank you for showing up today. Thank you for daring. Thank you for sharing and for telling.
Thank you so much again for
Yeah.
having me, Selena.
Once again, thank you for being a part of Dare to Share Your Untold Story and helping to be a voice in breaking down the barriers of mental stigma. To all of our listeners, if you like what you've been hearing on this podcast and you want to be part of breaking down barriers of mental stigma, I invite you to go wherever you are listening to the episode and hit subscribe. Leave us a comment or a review of the episode and maybe how you relate to it. To learn more about what we offer, visit www.daretoheal.co. And if you are feeling ready and brave to share, please submit your story by visiting www.daretoshare.co. Thanks for joining in.